All right, well, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started on what has actually become a sunny and quite beautiful day here in Boston. It's great to see how many of you we have on the line, so thanks a lot for taking the time out of your busy schedules today. So today's topic is on evaluating WCM vendors, and we're going to be sharing the latest techniques for making the right decision. By way of a quick introduction, my name is Rebecca Martin, and I'm a business development manager here at Real Story Group. So I'm going to start by sharing a few housekeeping notes, and then I'm going to finish up by giving you kind of a high-level overview of who we are here at Real Story Group. So first, for those of you on the call, as a follow-up, we're going to be passing along the slides for your reference. For the subscribers on the line, an archived version of today's webinar will be made available to you. And then finally, if you have any questions as we move through the presentation, feel free to type your questions up in the question window, and we'll be sure to address it. All right, so let's get started. We are now finishing up the third quarter of 2016, and as you are formulating or really refining your digital strategies plan moving forward, you're going to want to make sure that you have the right web content and experience management foundation in place. And what I mean by the right technology is that it's really based on your organization's unique needs and use cases. You know, too often I'm having conversations with people who say, you know, I wish I had known about you or had talked to you last year when I was in the middle of this huge technology selection process. So I'm confident this webinar is going to be a valuable use of your time. You're going to really leave here with a deeper understanding of the current marketplace, because we're going to be exploring future trends and outline some of the best practices and the latest techniques for a successful web CMS product selection. So who is Real Story Group, for those of you on the phone who aren't familiar with us? We are a research and advisory firm. So we're similar to some of the other research firms out there who produce research, but we're different in several ways, some really important ways, we think. So first, I'd like to highlight some of the tools that we make available to our subscribers. So what you see on the slide here up top is our Real Quadrant app, which is a shortlist generator tool. But what's unique about it is that it directs you to the digital workplace and marketing tools that best match your unique requirements, the goals and strategic considerations that you have. It's not a one-size-fits-all single snapshot of the marketplace, and you're going to hear a lot more on the Real Quadrant tool in just a few minutes. We also have a tool that allows you to benchmark your organization's digital effectiveness using RealScore. If you haven't heard of RealScore, it's an app on our website. It assigns a numerical grade that you can use to benchmark your organization's capabilities in the context of a progressive roadmap, your progress over time in relation to your peers. And the last thing that I would point out as far as tools that we offer is really we offer advisory services in the context of our subscription offerings. So what I mean by that is we can help you in a bunch of different ways on your technology buying journey. So I guess to point out a few, we can help organizations refine their shortlist. Maybe you're looking to divorce your current vendor. We can coach you through that. Coach you on pricing. There's a number of different ways that we work with companies in this capacity. So that's just kind of an overview of some of the different ways we engage with different organizations. So moving on to our areas of focus. So what you see on the right-hand side of the screen here, you see a glimpse of our 2016 digital vendor map. So this map is a great visual for outlining the vendors that we cover in all of the different marketplaces that we evaluate. So you can find a copy of our vendor map on our website at realstorygroup.com. But to expand just for a second on the marketplaces that we evaluate, what we focus on is what we call content-based technologies. And what that means is that we're looking at 7 different marketplaces and following the products and the vendors within those 7 marketplaces. So if you bucketed those marketplaces into 2 larger groups, what we focus on is content-based digital marketing technologies and content-based digital workplace technologies. So technology for getting the right content to the right person outside the organization, and then technology for getting the right content to the right person inside the organization. And so we've been around for 15 years looking solely at these content-based technologies. So we feel like we know them pretty well, and we've been following some of the vendors for up to 15 years, and we've really seen their progression. But really what our companies been designed to do is highlight what these products are good at, but maybe importantly for the buyers of technology is what they're not so good at. And we're constantly trying to educate our subscribers and our customers as to which technology is the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do. So we were founded 15 years ago by Tony Byrne. You're going to hear from him in a second. And he founded our company really in the vein of consumer reports. And a lot of people are familiar with consumer reports, but we're seen really as a consumer reports of this space. And it manifests itself, I would say, in a couple of ways. So the first way is what I just mentioned around producing research. We produce the research, but we provide deep dive evaluations on the vendors and their products. And again, we have a methodology on evaluating them on a variety of different criteria, but fundamentally getting into what they're good at, where they're good fit, and then they're not so good at. But to take that consumer reports analogy just a little bit further, this is probably the biggest differentiator of our firm, is that we follow about 150 products, but we don't work for the vendors in any way. So we don't advise technology vendors on their product strategy. We do not write white papers for technology vendors. We don't speak at their conferences. We don't take a meal from technology vendors. And believe it or not, we've found this to be unique in the analyst space, and we have yet to find another analyst firm that adheres to this type of business model. And because we're able to keep that strict independence, it really allows us to give you, the buyers of technology, the real story. So that's where our name comes from. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Tony Byrne. He's our founder of Real Story Group. He's the original author of our web content and experience management research, and a 20-year technology industry veteran. So with that, Tony, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. And it's good to see a lot of you on the line here from around the globe. This is going to be a really fast-paced tour. Those of you who know me know I'm really excited about this particular topic, both the content of web content and experience management and what it can do and how it can help you be more successful, but also what's the right way to make sure that you have the right vendor. And you know, we pitched this as the latest techniques, and I think this is the best refinement of a methodology that we're sharing with you. On the other hand, you know, we have to also look at these things perhaps a little bit more progressively in the long view. This was a tweet that I put out this morning that, you know, we've added 3 new vendors to our WCM research. We've also removed 3 vendors from the research in this latest update that we just put out. So yeah, the marketplace is shifting. It's just not shifting very fast. So, you know, there's a lot of talk about disruption and new business models and things like that. And there's obviously a little bit of truth to that, but also it's not like 2016. I'm not going to sit here and give you the traditional analyst line that 2016 is tectonically different from 2015 and you're going to have to change the way you do everything. No, there's still some very kind of common evergreen themes, and in particular around what does the marketplace look like and how you should approach it. At the same time, there are some shifts and some interesting new trends that we'll talk about as well. So I think a lot of you recognize this quadrant. It's done by a friend of mine, Martin White. He's obviously spoofing a very famous other quadrant. You might call this the mystical quadrant, and this is one way to select vendors. We happen to think it's the wrong way, and I'll explain why a little bit later. But as Rebecca mentioned, I think a lot of it often comes down to, you know, almost a kind of a faith-based decision that, you know, you make it, you're in a hurry to get to the right tool for obvious reasons. You want to pilot and launch. You have aggressive digital plans, and at a certain point, a lot of the companies that we talk to, the organizations that we talk to, at some point they just kind of make a leap of faith. And, you know, this is an area where we would argue don't necessarily go on just a hunch. You really want to have some empirical information and data behind you to make the right choice. That's not going to guarantee that you're going to be successful, but it bodes well then for setting you on the right path, right? So it's not sufficient to have the right technology, but it is necessary to really then, you know, execute on your strategies to have the right fit. So I'm going to talk about today in connection with web content management marketplace and how to select tools is really looking at the marketplace from a complexity spectrum. I think that's probably the single most important differentiator among the tools. Talk about the marketplace and how fragmented it is. We do a brief detour into the wrong way to select the tools, and then we'll close out with the majority of the time being spent on what's the right way to select the tools. So in any technology marketplace, there is a spectrum that is the product platform spectrum, and this is fundamentally a complexity spectrum, where you have on the far left platforms, even kind of toolkits and frameworks that in the hands of a developer, you can do wonderfully complex, interesting, and differentiating things. Of course, the more platform-like something is, typically the more costly it is, the more complex it is, oftentimes greater time to deploy. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you have products, which are simpler, out of the box, very often now available in multi-tenant cloud, so called software as a service. And these products often do one or two things very, very well, easy to deploy, often less expensive, but they also have ceilings and limitations in terms of certain capabilities that maybe you can't get no matter how much time, money, ibuprofen, developers, pizza that you throw at it. It still can't do something, whereas something that's more platform-like you can shape to your heart's content, assuming that you do have enough resources to do that. So this is always a spectrum in any technology marketplace. And I think it's particularly germane and probably the most defining way to look at the WCM marketplace. Now, what's interesting about this is that, you know, in our own benchmarking, you've told us that your own maturity level with respect to web content management is not necessarily very high. You know, and with respect to media and publishing, you're scoring yourself around a 32, 33 out of 65, so that's not bad. But certainly in higher ed, financial services, not-for-profit, we're seeing kind of lower scores with respect to your own effectiveness assessments. And so this is just a little caveat I throw in there that we all tend to love the more complex tools at the high end of the marketplace. They certainly demo very well. Integrators like them. Agencies and integrators often like to introduce them into their customers, but you have to ask yourself, am I really ready for this? And I'm going to come back to that theme a little bit later. But first, let's take a look at our latest incarnation of the marketplace. This is certainly not all of the some 2,000 different vendors that are out there in the world, but these are the 35, 36 that we tend to think are the most important. And again, we put them on a complexity spectrum where the most complex ones, which you should read as, you know, certainly the richest, but also the most expensive in terms of total cost of ownership, on the far left, and then the simpler products are on the far right, and then there's this whole spectrum in between. Now, this is a two-dimensional look at this universe. Obviously, a more multi-dimensional look would go into things like geographic orientation of the vendor, license model, is it open source, how big is the vendor, what technology does it run on, Java, .NET, PHP, what have you. So this is definitely a multi-dimensional issue, but we think that this complexity spectrum and placing yourself on the spectrum is really important to sort of understand that. And in some level, this is what is your level of appetite, how effective are you operationally, what are the level of resources you have to truly leverage these tools. So you have like the upper range players, most of whom you've probably heard of, and then beneath them over here on the left, legacy platforms. These tend to be tools that you leave rather than you license. We find most of our subscribers are in the process of replacing these technologies with more contemporary tools. SharePoint, a little bit of an outlier because it's still obviously quite prevalent in an internet environment, typically wouldn't use it for a public website. And then we move over all the way to the far end to the simpler products. And there's been a general, I would say, in the marketplace, including 2016, a kind of a right to left move. We've graduated WordPress from simpler product to mid-range product because it's covering more complex scenarios. In general, you could kind of draw a line down the middle here between mid-range platforms and products and say everything to the right, you might be able to get away without having a full-time developer. Everything to the left, anything that's platform here, you better have at least one full-time developer dedicated to the platform. A couple new entrants here we'll mention. In the mid-range platforms, we have Contentful and Brightspot, two newer solutions able to leverage more contemporary Java frameworks. Both companies are struggling a little bit to build the all-important ecosystem around it, so there's some risks for you as a customer, but they're certainly both very interesting. We also added GX software in the mid-range products. They've been around actually for a long, long time. It's just recently that they have kind of pushed out beyond their Benelux cocoon to take a more kind of international profile. And so some interesting pros and cons with that vendor as well. So again, there's changes in this marketplace. Some vendors departing or becoming less important, plateauing, and others certainly moving in to take their place. So in analyst speak, though, if you look at this, the term to use is fragmented. This is a highly fragmented marketplace. Nobody has any more than, maybe WordPress has maybe 20% share of the market. Even that might be a little bit suspect. I mean, the reality is this is a highly fragmented marketplace, and the typical vendor here doesn't have any more than 1, 2, 3% market share tops. So you have a lot of choices. And the one thing I wanted to get back to was this sort of notion of complexity, and you see this right away with what even people want to do increasingly, which is doing some content targeting, right? And these tools demo very, very well, but I think once you start using them, you realize that the user experience and the marketer's experience around how do you actually target this content? What if you have multiple different variants? How do you measure this? How do you audit this? How do you track this? How do I know the downstream effects if I change one of those? There's still a lot of work to do in terms of simplifying these interfaces. I would tend to think, we tend to see them actually getting more complex over time. So again, that's just giving more confirmation to this kind of right to left push here. These systems are becoming more feature rich, but also more complex. And it's why it's all the more important to set up our next conversation, which is that you really need an empirical, hands-on approach to trying out these tools before you actually buy them. Otherwise, you risk buying something that looked really good in a demo, and then when you actually try to test drive it yourself, it can often sort of fall over for you. Another key architectural theme that I think has really arisen in 2016 is this whole notion of headless or head optional CMS, and the idea here is that if you look at this sort of customer-centric reference model that we have, there's a lot of things that you want to be doing in these customer touch points. If you look at the gray areas here, digital media, asset management, e-commerce, customer support, campaign and lead management, you have a variety of different business platforms to support a variety of different customer journeys. And one of these is content and experience management, but you may want to also push content to other sorts of applications, like your contact center, like your e-commerce environment. And so the key there from an architectural perspective is that something is headless, or we would like to say head optional. In our latest research, we get into a lot of details about this. There's a lot of complexity here, even less so from the technical standpoint and more from an operational standpoint, and in particular from a marketing experience standpoint, around understanding the downstream multi-channel implications of the changes that you make to the content. But clearly this is an emerging and increasingly important use case that we've certainly been helping our subscribers build into their RFPs. Okay, I'll remind you here as we now look at how to select these tools that you can ask any question you want in the GoToMeeting question control, the panel. In your GoToMeeting control panel, there's a questions tab. You can ask any question, or if you want to agree with something, even more interestingly, if you want to disagree with something, feel free to chime in. We'll certainly have time at the end. So here's 4 ways not to select tools. I'll describe these, and then we'll talk about the right way to do it. So the first one is the traditional kind of horse race. Somebody's as a hot vendor, they're in the upper right quadrant, what have you. So they're a winning vendor, so I want to get on that horse. And the reality is that, vendors tend to go through hype cycles. They go up, they go down. The key thing is not which is the winning horse, but which is the right horse for you. The second one is love at first sight. We see this a lot in this segment and others. I go see a demo of something, or I see a vendor at a conference, I get all excited, I must have that. The reality is that all these vendors have competitors. They all have, very few of them have things that they do uniquely, although they have interesting combinations of attributes. So you definitely want to avoid that. The third one is my cousin Vinny, which is my cousin Vinny uses Drupal, therefore I should use Drupal. Now, of course, you do want to talk to your peers, but the reality is that your organization is different in terms of its needs, in terms of its maturity, level of resources, and just because someone else uses something doesn't necessarily mean it's right for you. The fourth one is the most common and at some level maybe the most pernicious. We call this happiness is a stack of warm binders that I develop all these long Excel spreadsheets of requirements, and I tie them back to business case, and I make vendors fill out all of these charts, and I imagine that in putting all that detail into it that somehow scientifically I'm going to get to the best result. Actually, what it ends up doing is cluttering you and diluting what's really important to you, particularly around architectures and usability, which are two of the key elements of these platforms. So what's the right way to do this? I'm going to step you through what we describe as an agile methodology. By agile, we mean that it is team-based, it's iterative, and it's adaptive, and above all, it's empirical. So first, you want to build an interdisciplinary selection team that has both business, marketing, content, UX stakeholders, as well as a variety of potentially different IT stakeholders, including systems people, security, certainly developers, and put together this interdisciplinary selection team. However, it should ideally be led and chaired by a business person. And you start looking at your requirements. A traditional way to do this is to look at features and functionality, and we certainly do that in our research. This is a screenshot from our WCM report looking at a variety of different things from a technology, content, and experience standpoint in terms of the categories of things that we look at. And, you know, this is important, but in some ways, these are too fine-grained and out of context for use in an actual RFP. They're interesting to learn about the vendors, and that's how we use them. But what you really want to do instead is avoid the checklists that come out of this, and instead go through what Agile calls for, which is actual user stories. We call these testable narratives. Actual scenarios, other people call them use cases. There's a variety of different ways to structure this. This is an example of just how we've done one for a public university. And to actually build these narratives, it's part science, it's also part art, but it's these sorts of test cases that really drive you to being able to see how the solution could work for you in your environment, and ultimately get you to a place where you can get hands-on with the tools to simulate how you'd actually use it before you actually buy it. And so this then is the testable process we recommend going through, coming up with a longest short list, refining that down to a shorter short list of people who would receive this RFP. And again, the RFP is not a checklist, it's a series of questions and user stories. Of course, we sell research for a living, so we're big fans of using research to help you get to this right list. But any way you do it, you want to make sure that you test a good variety of different vendors from across different categories within the complexity spectrum to kind of understand where you are. Then you want to narrow that down for vendor demos where they're demoing your scenarios. And ultimately, and most importantly, getting to a hands-on bake-off or POC, or what some people call a POC, where you are actually hands-on testing the tools, taking it for a test drive in your neighborhood, actually running through the scenarios yourself to make sure that you've got the right solution. Now, the thing about that is we've been talking about the technology. There's also a number of other strategic considerations that you want to take in mind about both the vendor and the community around the vendor. And we found that vibrant communities are really critical for the long-term viability and stability of the technology. And so that's obviously an area where historically open source software, which otherwise has sometimes some lodestones and demerits, otherwise it thrives in terms of being able to support these sorts of wide-ranging communities, which really help the customer base. But it also gets down to things like customer support, services partners, software partners, all sorts of things. And so strategic considerations also a key part of what you want to be looking at. So how do you put, this is obviously then it's a multidimensional problem. I can hear you saying, Tony, I've got to look at scenarios, I've got to look at strategic considerations, I've got to look at geography, I've got to look at my complexity level, all these sorts of things. How do I go about doing that? So I'm going to show you an example using what we call our real quadrant shortlist generator. So this is a tool that we have, and you can certainly try it out for free. I'm just going to walk you through this to show you how one way to address what is, again, a multidimensional challenge. So I'll just go here to real quadrant, and we're going to say, I'm going to select one of the streams here, one of the technologies. I'm going to do the Web Content and Experience Management Marketplace. So let's go ahead and get started with that. And so the first thing it's going to do is ask me what attributes. So, am I open to different sorts of technologies? Well, yes, let's say I am. Do I care about commercial license open source? No, that doesn't. What about cloud versus on-premise? So here I'm going to say, look, I'll do with managed cloud, single tenant, and on-premise, but I'm not, maybe I'm in financial services or something. There's no way I'm going to be able to be in a multi-tenant software as a service. And let's say that I'm based primarily in EMEA, so I don't want to be looking at vendors that are only available in the Americas. So next up, it asks me the all-important scenario question. So these are, what are the really important scenarios for me here? And so I tend to tell you, don't select a lot of these, select the ones that are really important. So in this case, let's say I'm a media site, so mostly I'm about pushing through a lot of information, but I'm doing this in a multilingual environment, and mobile is increasingly important to me. So I'm going to say these three scenarios. Now, here's the fun part, and this is the part where we make it a real quadrant. You might think of it as kind of like my quadrant, which is I can start weighting these things to decide, okay, well, I'm a media company, so I'm going to make this instead of 33% this scenario, I'm going to make it 50%. I'm going to make these other two 25%. So let's do that. Let's see, we're already there. Let's go here. Say 25. There we go. Okay. And then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to have the vendor implement this. So now here's where we talk about the strategic considerations, what's really important to me. So let's say, for me, based on my previous experience, I think, the vendor is really important to me. I may have had a difficulty with the previous vendor, and so I'm going to kind of overweight some of the more vendor ones. And then I'm going to say my tech team thinks that technical modernity is really important, and then let's say value for money. These are the things that are going to be really important. So rather than just taking this generic for each one of these 10 as assigning them a weighting of 10%, oops, sorry, we ended up backspacing there. All right, we may have to just go through this again. Hopefully it has, all right, we're going to just, I'm just going to, I did an accidental backspace there. It wouldn't be a demo without a little glitch here. I'm just going to take the generic weightings. You saw that you can actually weight these yourself. And what this does then is give me essentially a custom quadrant here. So first of all, we see that there's a lot of vendors here. That's because, again, it's a highly fragmented marketplace. So we're not one of those analyst firms that just gives you, okay, here's the top 10, because we don't think that's really realistic. That, there's potentially 25 different vendors, but they have different fit here. So relative to the scenario and the strategy, on the y-axis, it's the strategic consideration. On the x-axis, it's the scenario fit. We'll take a look at open text here. This is the former HP product, and we show how did they end up here. Well, they're pretty good for mobile, not really good for multilingual. And there's some real issues here from a strategic consideration, some serious challenges there with TeamSite having just been acquired by OpenText, so that's kind of why it's down here in the lower part. And so you can, of course, remove this, you can remove and add vendors and do interesting things here. And, if I go ahead and log in, then what we see here is the, the full Monty here, all of the different vendors laid out, and I can do, different things with them. So that's, that's certainly our approach via Real Quadrant about how to do this, but it also suggests to you that, these are multi-dimensional challenges. You need to take a number of different things into consideration before you move on. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to download a sample of our WCM research, which we just updated, put under a brand new format for 2016. Getting a lot more into strategic considerations and customer impact. So we're really excited about it and encourage you to sample it if you haven't already. And then also, again, come back and ask yourself, how much WCM are we really ready for? And so you can go to our Real Score application, which also is free to use. It's a kind of a freemium model. You go to realstorygroup.com/realscore and put in your own attributes and see how you stack up against your peers. So with that, I will turn it back over to Rebecca while I just review your questions really quickly here. And Rebecca, maybe you can just close out here for 30 seconds while I look at these questions, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thanks, Tony. So Tony mentioned the latest update to our WebCMS research that came out a couple of weeks ago, and there's just 3 important considerations that I wanted to highlight to have you keep in mind as you consider leveraging research prior to selecting a WebCMS vendor. So the first thing that I'd mention is that all of the major vendors in this marketplace are moving to the cloud, but in very different ways. So our research differentiates these approaches and uncovers impacts for customers. The second thing I'd mention is that vendors are putting more effort into supporting customer engagement, particularly around personalization, which is increasingly important, but the usability of these platforms for marketers varies widely, and we offer the inside scoop on how they stack up there. And then the last thing that I'd mention is that, you know, the web CMS must now fit within the broader MarTech architectures in ways that it didn't have to even 2 years ago. And our research goes into detail about how vendors fare at these key integration points. So just a few things to keep in mind. We already talked about how you can download a sample of the update at realstorygroup.com. But Tony, I just want to make sure there's time for any questions. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
we've got some great questions. Thanks, Rebecca. So the first one's from Julie. What does it take for a vendor to move from mid-range product to mid-range platform? And what are the distinguishings between these? So Julie's talking about that breakdown where we had the vendors in 5 different categories based on complexity. And basically what it takes is that the tool becomes much more developer-centric and becomes something that you don't just want a developer, that you really need a developer to get full value out of it. And then it becomes a platform and not a product per se. And obviously there's pros and cons. I'm not saying that platforms are better than one or the other. At the very, very high end of the marketplace is where you see, you know, tools with mid to upper 6-figure licensing. These are the really complex sort of toolkits. So Dave is asking a good question. Do you see customers taking a path of selecting a smaller, simpler product for the near term, knowing they might eventually move to something bigger and pricier like AEM later? And the short answer is, Dave, yes, we do see organizations doing that. And what's interesting is sometimes they never need to move on to that bigger, pricier thing. And it's a kind of a, you know, starter home, and you may end up living in it in more than a couple of years. So this can be a very reasonable approach. I think there are downsides to it, obviously, which is that if you mature and expand your digital team and you outgrow that product sooner than you thought, then you've got a migration, and migrations are always a trip to the dentist. So, you know, no one ever really looks forward to it. The other thing that we see, Dave, a lot of customers doing, and we've coached a number of our subscribers in this, is having a simpler and a complex product in their toolkit, particularly larger enterprises, where they use the simpler product for simple digital scenarios and the more complex product for more complex digital scenarios. It's not always easy to pull off operationally, but it can be highly valuable. So one last question from Leslie. Ideally, where do you want to have the vendor be on the graph? So she's talking about the real quadrant where we had the 4 quadrants. And so there's no necessarily any magic place to be. I think what we tell people is definitely look at, you know, upper left, upper right, and lower right. Lower left you can definitely pretty much rule out because it's not going to be a good scenario fit and it's not going to be a good strategic fit. But upper left, you can have a good, a good strategic fit, and you may have to do some work on scenarios. Lower right, good scenario fit, but you might have to work on some strategic considerations, some risks there that you might have to mitigate. Because we're tough scorers, we don't put as many people into the upper right as maybe some other analyst firms do. We're a little bit tougher on the vendor, but clearly, you know, being in the upper right suggests that that's a plausible set of vendors to look at. Doesn't mean that they're going to be perfect for you, because again, you've got to roll them through those use cases, but at least it gives you really good rationale for getting to the right shortlist. So With that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating today. Once again, you'll all get a copy of the deck. Those of you whose firms are already Real Story Group subscribers, you'll have on-demand access to the full recording of this. So it was a great pleasure seeing you all today, and look forward to staying in touch. For Real Story Group and my colleague Rebecca Martin, this is Tony Byrne saying so long.